Fabrizio Ricciardelli, Ph.D. from the University of Warwick in England, and now lives here in Florence and runs the Kent State University Study Abroad program here, and is also the president of ACOPI, which is the association which coordinates all the American study abroad programs in town. So he's a busy man and also a first-rate scholar and lecturer. So Fabrizio Machiavelli, over to you. Thank you. Oh, sorry, yeah, I forgot. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by Alice Wagner. So thanks, Alice, for that. Thank you.
So my name is Fabrizio Ricciardelli. I'm a Florentine, and I was born and raised here in the city of Florence, and got the chance of getting a PhD, starting a PhD at the University of Warwick in the Midlands at the end of the 1990s. And my professor was one of the main experts in Machiavelli. And at that time, I didn't consider this a lot because my research was mostly concentrated on the time of Dante. I'm not an expert on Machiavelli. I'm an expert of the time of Dante, meaning the period which goes from the 1250s to the 1348, the plague of 1348, when Florence was progressively built by architects like Arnolfo di Cambio. We have chroniclers like Giovanni Villani, Dino Compagni, and Dante himself was writing the Divine Comedy. So I was mostly fascinated by this period of time. Then getting older, I realized the importance of Machiavelli, and he probably left me this kind of heritage because the last lecture he gave at the University of Warwick was had the following title: Why Machiavelli Matters. And I was there in the audience, as you are now, and I was really fascinated by this this fantastic lecturer who was really involved in the audience and so on, talking about Machiavelli. But for me, to me, Machiavelli was someone really far from the chronology, from the period of time I was researching, and I was fascinated. Then in 3 years, I realized that probably Machiavelli, there are many Machiavellis, and that Machiavelli probably is one of the most important scholars, historians, politicians. I don't know how to define him. I define him as a prophet. I don't know if I'm correct. Tomorrow I will change my idea probably on this because I'm writing a book on Machiavelli. So every day I change idea because I don't know. There is a huge quantity of bibliography on Machiavelli with a huge quantity of interpretations, which is very difficult to like handle this topic. What I'm doing as a researcher, following the path of Humphrey Butters, is trying to go through the sources and trying to understanding why Machiavelli has been misunderstood in many phases right after his death in 1527. And the idea of this lecture is more or less the table of contents of my book. So the man, the prophet, the myth. So these kind of huge chapters in which you can put everything and nothing at the same time. The man is not so difficult, the biography of Machiavelli, and we were talking with Simon a few seconds ago. We have almost discovered and transcribed and published every possible source on Machiavelli at the moment. The idea of considering Machiavelli a prophet is a general empty vase within which we can put everything. Machiavelli is a very, first of all, he's a very intelligent person. So this is the most important thing to consider and underline. And very acute, so able to understand and preview the future. So this is the point. And the myth, it goes without saying. So we know that everyone wrote about the ends justify the means, il fine giustifica i mezzi. Machiavelli never wrote this sentence. So Machiavelli has been misunderstood many times by many historians, by many political scientists, and so on and so forth. Should you go back to the sources, you would read, a person who was approaching to his experience, in a really simple way. And with his brain was simply trying to give an end, to the society in which he was living. So let me start with the first chapter of this three big potential ways through which we can read about Machiavelli. And, is a Florentine. Machiavelli is a Florentine, was born in Florence in 1469 and dies in 1527. In these 50-something years, we have a big change within the Republic of Florence. And the big change is what I will mostly talk about, the big transition between Florence as a republican system into Florence as a principality. So the big transition between a proto-democratic system into a monarchy, in other words, which was progressively launched by Alessandro de' Medici after the siege of 1531 with the first Duke of Florence, Alessandro de' Medici, followed by Cosimo I in 1537. Machiavelli was, let's say, was born and raised in a not a rich family, a family which was, its origins were from Montespertoli, presumably, and with properties both in the countryside as well as in the city-state. And this is typical of every wealthy family. I'm mentioning the Caponi, the Frescobaldi, the Antinori, and many others, whose richness starts in the 1100s when, from the countryside, the city-state of Florence was mostly formed. You know, these owners of castles then using the marketplace of Florence as an opportunity, and then progressively building their towers, fighting as well for Ghibellines, both nobles, and then giving birth to one of the most interesting kind of examples of proto-democracy with 1282, when the priors were chosen among the populace, no? The popolo, which is one of the other key words for trying to understand in Machiavelli, the meaning of popolo. What's the meaning of popolo? Is not the mob, is not, you know, the popolo is something precise. Popolo grasso, popolo mediano, popolo minuto. There are many popoli in the city of Florence in the 13th, 14th, and 1500s. Bernardo Machiavelli was an attorney at law, was a lawyer, with no money. Very strange, I would say. Huh? But not so interested on the profession, that's the point. You know that in this period of time, we have a hierarchy among the popolo grasso, and on top, we have surely the first wool workers, those involved in the wool industry. Then, from the 1400s onwards, silk producers, no? Textile, fashion, more or less. Florence was made thanks to the ability of people of creating clothes and selling them all over the known markets, like the Flanders, and so on and so forth. And then we have the investment of his money into the money changing system, the banking system, but not as a banking system, it's a money changing system. At that time, the guild is of money changers. And then we have the other popoli grassi, popolani grassi, wealthy popolani are whom? Those who are coming out from these professions in which we have not necessarily wealthy people, but people with the knowledge, with culture, no? Attorneys at law, judges, notaries, and of course, pharmacists, doctors, and so on. So the upper ranks of the popolo is made of these people. Why this? Because should you be able, like Bernardo Machiavelli, to read and write, and should you have received a degree from a prestigious institution, you would have been one of the most potential resources for the community itself. Bernardo was not so interested in the profession, but he was very interested in reading the classics, the classical tradition, in the library of the Machiavelli family. The young Niccolò found the main possible sources ever, from Livy, Cicero, Seneca, and so on and so forth. The classical tradition, let's say. Bartolomea Tenelli, his mother, was, yes, a woman, and we know the role of women at that time. But she was very talented as well. She received, Giovanni Villani in the 1330s talks about the fact that 30% of young children in Florence had illiteracy. Not only males, also females. So Florence is a very interesting kind of environment in which we have males and females getting access to a certain kind of culture. She was a writer of poems. She wrote letters to Machiavelli himself. We know that she wrote letters to him while he was as an ambassador, because Machiavelli was, we'll see this a diplomat. Machiavelli was a segretario della seconda cancelleria della Repubblica di Firenze, secretary of the second chancellery of the Republic of Florence. So he was like, I don't know, Condoleezza Rice for the, I don't know, Antonio Tajani for the, the government nowadays, for the Meloni government. Someone was in charge of taking care of the relationship between the city-state, the dominant city in a regional, in a regional territory, in a territorial state, that of Florence, and satellite cities. So, person who was in charge of taking care of Pisa, Arezzo, San Gimignano, and so on and so forth. So this means that Machiavelli is coming out from a very interesting kind of environment in which you don't have so much money, but you have a huge level of culture. The problem is that not having so much money meant for him not having access to a, let's say, proper kind of academic profile. Machiavelli was a self-made man in terms of culture. He was a reader. He was a reader. And mostly he studied alone with private tutors, but not attending university systems. We sometimes forget that the first university institution in Europe was Bologna in 1088. And then we have, in the 1100s, many other institutions like Oxford 1198, Cambridge 1206, and so on and so forth. Florence is very late in terms of having a university system. We are late the 20s of the 1300s. But we know that the studio was very important in the city of Florence. Machiavelli could not have access to this kind of studies. But he had a very, very good library in his own apartment in Via Guicciardini. This is the genealogic tree. I took a picture in the house of Machiavelli in Sant'Andrea in Percussina. And this is the picture of his, the Machiavelli properties in the city of Florence. This is a very important element in the life of Machiavelli because, as I've said, these families which are coming out from, let's say, patrician roots, like the Machiavellis, with no money in that kind of generation, but with a noble profile, let's say, patrician profile, usually had properties both in the city as well as in the countryside. And we know that Machiavelli spent part of his life in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, which is now the Albergaccio, Taverna Machiavelli is the name that we give it today, but we can have lunch should we want, Sant'Andrea in Percussina, and following the roots of our Machiavelli, of our Niccolò. One of the things I've wondered many times, not only for Machiavelli, but in general, when I'm thinking to the Renaissance in general, is the following: what should they see while they were walking in the city of Florence? How were the streets? What kind of cleanness they had, while they were living in this period of time? And here I put some symbolical places like the Brotherhood of Mercy, 1244, first established in the city of Florence, one of the first hospitals in Europe. So Florence was, in the 1300s, had more than 10 hospitals in the city of Florence, in the city itself. All of them devoted to different kind of specializations. I'm thinking about the Hospital of Venus for abandoned children, and so on and so forth. San Pietro Martire, friar stopped in Florence and established through many donations the Bigallo, the Hospital of the Arciconfraternita della Misericordia. So this is something that Machiavelli saw, that Machiavelli absorbed, the idea that there is a relationship between the world of work and brotherhoods, that every brotherhood was not built with no money, it was built with the contribution of the citizens of Florence. So there is a sort of virtuous system which starts at the end of the 1200s in the city of Florence, through which we have the building of the beauty of the city of Florence. Otherwise, it's quite impossible to understand why we are surrounded by this fantastic beauty in terms of architecture, in terms of buildings. And second, why are we having so a huge quantity of works of art concentrated in this small, space, as Florence is, like 4 kilometers in terms of space. It's because we have a virtuous system which starts in the early stages of the Republican system of Florence. This kind of continuous interaction between the world of work and the community. So the citizen is not something detached from the community. He's an integral part of the community and contributes to the community with his or her own taxation. So this is the point. You should be enrolled in a guild, and being enrolled in a guild meant that you would have given part of your income to the guild itself. The guild reinvested into the community part of this income. So this is the reason why we have so many hospitals, kindergartens, schools, the high level of literacy in the city of Florence before Machiavelli, like the prince before the prince, now Machiavelli before Machiavelli. So Machiavelli lives 2 centuries later with this kind of heritage. So in other words, he finds the possibility of going in a place like this, studying also in public libraries, not only his own private one. So the environment is very, now cannot say modern, but pre-modern, let's say, for many respects. And then, of course, he saw Palazzo Medici Riccardi. He perfectly had an interaction with the Medici family. He knew perfectly who Cosimo the Elder was. He knew who Giovanni de' Medici was, his father. He knew who Piero de' Medici was. He knew who Lorenzo the Magnificent was. He was born while Lorenzo was controlling the city. Machiavelli was a child when the Pazzi conspiracy happened. 1478. He was born in 1469, like a child, 9 years old, listening, to this kind of harsh event which occurred in the Cathedral of Florence on April 26, 1478, when the Pazzi family, helped by Sixtus IV, the Pope, tried to subvert the republicanism of Florence, killing both Lorenzo and Giuliano in front of an audience, the perfect example of conspiracy, killing those who were embodying the state. And of course, Machiavelli perfectly understood the importance of a municipality, of a town hall built by Arnolfo di Cambio in the 1290s, but in which we have an inscription, and this is very important, Rex Regum et Dominus Dominantium, because everybody takes a look to the David, but no one takes a look to the inscription you have protected by the 2 lions in the main entrance. The Rex Regum et Dominus Dominantium is Christ, evidently, but we are not in a cathedral. We are in front of town hall, the municipality of Florence, and we know that Christ is the gate, which makes you change in dimension from this one to the eternal one. Is embodying the idea, the spirits of the divine. So Machiavelli knew that Palazzo Vecchio, or better, sorry, Palazzo della Signoria, or Palazzo dei Priori, better, for being philologically correct. But I'm Florentine, so for me it's Palazzo Vecchio, was something more sacred than any possible cathedral. Okay? Because in front of a civic, secular building, there is a religious inscription, a spiritual inscription. So Machiavelli was already trained, and that's the reason why I defined him as a prophet. Because when we think about prophecies, we think about religiosity. But there is a philological definition which needs to be given to this category. And the question is the following: is the sacred only religious, or is something more on top of this? What is sacred? What is the meaning of sacrality? Is only a cathedral sacred, or is also a building like this? For the Florentines, the answer is straight. It's also the town hall sacred. It's untouchable. You cannot violate the building. You cannot betray the state. And betraying the state meant, for this society, going against, committing the worst possible sin ever. the legislation of the Republic of Florence. Machiavelli perfectly knew how the machine of the Republic of Florence worked. And we have a very, very interesting kind of proto-democracy in the city of Florence, starting in the 1200s, end of the 1200s, and through the 13 and mostly 1400s. Niccolò Rubinstein wrote the most important works on this. But to be straight and to be clear, we have 4 elements we need to be considered to arrive to the launching of a law in the Republic of Florence. First, the arengo, the parlamentum, the square. Now we have the internet, we have Safari, we have, Blackboard, we have iPhones, we have a lot of ways for communicating. At that time, this is a face-to-face society. It was existing only in the moment in which you were in front of someone. So people met in the square, in the arengo, in the concione, in the parlamentum, we find in the sources, and then voted, voted and elected people. As soon as the proposal was shared by the many in the square, it entered into the Palazzo Pubblico. And then we have the Consiglio Maggiore, which is the room of the 500s now, as we know. Then we have the room of the 200s. And the inscription at the main entrance, should you go there tomorrow, is Festina lente, affrettati lentamente, so be fast but slowly. And as soon as this proposal entered into the councils, it could be mentioning the English, way of leading the democratic system in England. That could be the House of the Lords and the House of the Commons. And it was discussed, and we have the Consultem Pratiche. Every session is recorded in the State Archive of Florence. We have everything, with first names, second names, and the votation and the motion. Okay, everything. As soon as the proposal entering into the 2 councils was voted, it was recorded by the Consultem Pratiche. Okay, and of course they were voted through the white or black beans. Machiavelli knew perfectly this kind of system, okay? Because he worked with this kind of system. Then we have the Libri Fabarum. The Libri Fabarum, as I was saying, is a system through which we vote through the beans, white or bean. White, positive, yes, let's go ahead with this proposal. Then black, no, we need to rephrase it, recontrol it, and so on, as we do now in the parliament in Rome, or in the senates, should we want to start from the Senate in passing a bill in the Republic of Italy. If the proposal received, after the discussion, the voting, a positive feedback, it arrived where Machiavelli was, in the office where he was listening to this kind of votes, was copying everything. And then we have the writing of the proposal, which is now a law, into the provisioni, the provisions, provisioni. As well as the Consultem Pratica and Libri Fabarum in Florence, we have all the records from the 1100s to now. Nothing has been missed, okay? Think how scared can be a PhD student in front of these things. So in other words, and I have to be, I think, shorter because otherwise we end at midnight. The political administration of the city-state of Florence is very, very proto-democratic. It's very, very modern. No? We cannot talk about democracy, evidently, because something I've not mentioned in this presentation, but what about those who were not eligible? The eligibility is the key word to understand what Machiavelli was doing. Because the ruling class was always deciding those who were put in the bags. So should you be close to the Medici family, you would have been in one of these bags. The slips had the first and second names of everyone who was considered eligible. So that's the key element to understand the mechanism of the Republican system of Florence. And then you have the extraction. They were picked by the bags, but no matter who was elected, the system was always under the roof of the Medici coalition. And this is the tratte. Tratto is a past participle in Italian from trarre, which means to pick up, no? Picked up, extracted from the bags. So this is the list of the candidates. This was done for every public office in the state of Florence. Everything. Judiciary, fiscal, political. Think how chaotic it was. First of all, chaotic, not chaotic. I used not a precise, definition of the system, but let's say complicated enough for not having anyone rising, going up as a dictator, as a tyrant. Everyone could contribute to the state, but no one could be the first. In fact, when we talk about Cosimo the Elder, we have the first among equals, primus inter pares, but never, someone who, we need to wait 1531, as I've said before at the beginning, with Alessandro de' Medici. The transformation of this republican system, proto-democratic, into a vertical power, at the top of which we have only one person. The nightmare for Machiavelli. Okay? So Machiavelli was devoting his life to avoid this. Now here, I put a general slide on was the republican system of Florence stable or was not? According to me, it was a little bit, very, very well organized. And in fact, it was adopted, this system, by many other city-states. I'm thinking about the Republic of Siena, thinking about the Republic of Pisa, I'm thinking about the Republic of Venice, I'm thinking about every possible other republican system in the 14 as well as in the early 1500s. Now, progressively, what we have in the Italian peninsula, which is again one of the very interesting example of how democracy can be is developing itself. From a city-state like Florence, we pass to a regional state. There is a slide somewhere here which I'm mentioning all the different, not only conquests by the city-state of Florence, but acquisitions. I'm thinking about Arezzo, 1348. I'm thinking about San Gimignano, 1356. I'm thinking about Pisa, 1401, 1404, and then revolting against the state of Florence, at the beginning of the 1500s, something that Machiavelli should have handled. So Florence was transforming itself into the dominant city of a regional state, with the exception of Siena. Machiavelli didn't see the acquisition of Siena because Siena was the pain in the back for Florence, like Cuba for the US. Or I don't know what else, something which was not possible to be conquered, culturally speaking, not only with an army. Siena is Sienese, still now. The only thing you have in Siena, should you go there tomorrow, is the coat of arms of the Medici in the middle of Palazzo Pubblico. But the Sienese are never conquered by the Medici, never. Even if Cosimo I entered in 1555 with the troops, with the army in Siena. Then another element which is important to understand the life of Machiavelli, the writings of Machiavelli, the way in which Machiavelli approaches to his personal life, is again the idea of sacrality. Every document in the city-state of Florence should be signed, should be guaranteed, and in the name of God, blessed by God. In nome del Dio buon guadagno, in the name of God and the Holy Church of Rome. Everything is always blessed, guaranteed by this kind of, huge but powerful umbrella. And the same is for the Book of the Gospels, which is always in front of every politician who was in the condition of deciding for the community. The idea of the common good needs to be blessed by God. So those who wrote about Machiavelli, and this is the first element for misunderstanding Machiavelli, is considering Machiavelli an antichrist. Machiavelli could not be against the Catholic Church of Rome because he was living in the 1400s and 1500s, and you could not be something else than a good Christian at that time. Could criticize the church for its corruption, but not being against itself. Ecco, when Machiavelli was in his 20s, Lorenzo de' Medici died, 1492. Charles VIII was entering Italy, 1494, and then Savonarola was taking off. I need to go ahead because I have like 60 slides. So Savonarola, the Dominican friar, coming from Ferrara, starting preaching in a moment of political vacuum in the city of Florence. 1492, Lorenzo was too charming, too powerful, too great. The person who had guaranteed the peace of Lodi in the 1450s, the political equilibrium of these main powers we have in the Italian peninsula, the Republic of Venice, north and eastern part of it, and then the Duchy of Milan, the Duchy of Turin, the Savoy family. And then in the middle of Italy, we have these small ducal regimes in Emilia-Romagna. No, then we have Cesare Borgia later. The Republic of Florence, so powerful in central Italy. And then we have the Vatican State, the Holy See, which was huge. You know, the power of the Holy See went up to Chioggia, south of Venice, more or less, and at the beginning of the Marche region. Then we have the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So we have more or less 5 to 6 big political powers in the same small land. No? And that's what Machiavelli is saying. Let's try to find an agreement. Let's try to find a solution. Let's try to not fight each other, because otherwise we'll be conquered by someone else. No? Charles V. So this is the situation in which he was living. And he was living in the moment in which he was 29 years old, when Pierre Soderini was chosen as the guarantor, gonfaloniere di giustizia a vita, prime minister, I don't know how to define him. Yes, probably prime minister. With different roles, but mostly someone who was very close to Bernardo Machiavelli. Coluccio Salutati probably was a close friend of Bernardo Machiavelli, father of Niccolò. And surely a good word was shared, was given, for having him, because we don't know, d'emblée, Machiavelli became, at the age of 29, segretario della seconda cancelleria della Repubblica di Firenze, secretary of the second chancellery of the Republic of France. From 1498, then in 1502, we have the rise of Pier Soderini as gonfaloniere di giustizia a vita until 1512. So these years, which are crucial to understand Machiavelli. This is the moment in which Machiavelli is reflecting on the common good, is thinking about how to handle a state. And then something happens. The republicanism of Pier Soderini fails for many reasons, but surely because the pressure, which was shaken, by the preaching of Savonarola and many other events which occurred in the city of Florence, determined a change of power. And Machiavelli was accused of treason against the state, tortured, put in the stink prison, and then not killed, not murdered, not sentenced to a public execution, but exiled forever from the state of Florence. And he went to Sant'Andrea in Percussina. We are in 1513, end of 1512, beginning of the following year. And here Machiavelli writes down his main masterpieces. That's the place where he writes. Before he wrote discourses, speeches, but not something concrete on the reflection of the political regime, the nature of political regimes, as he is doing while he is forced into exile in Sant'Andrea in Percussina. And this recalls me Dante Alighieri as well, because Dante had the same kind of sort, if you think about that. Dante starts writing good things when he's in exile. January 18, 1302, he is banned from the city of Florence. Then the reiteration of the ban is March, I don't remember, it should be 15. And then he's sentenced to death in the following month. So he cannot return to Florence. So two geniuses who are suffering the same kind of destiny, no? Forced to be exiled, forced to live outside of their native land, the place in which they would have loved to be. But this condition probably is the real reason why he's reflecting a lot on the nature of power, on the nature of political power, on the nature of the common good. And all the things I've tried to touch with this presentation are connected to each other. The end of his life is 1527. He dies and he's buried in the Church of Santa Croce. Now, Machiavelli is a prophet. I don't know if he's a prophet. Every day I change title to this chapter. Is it a prophet or is it a utopist? You know, or is a philosopher or a politician? Now I'm in the stage in which he's a prophet, because I'm thinking about the idea of sacrality, the meaning of sacred, no? As I was mentioning before, and supported by not only myself. You know, there are many eminent historians. I'm mentioning Maurizio Viroli among the many who are convinced that Michele Lodone, professor at the University of Modena and Reggio, probably first Michele Lodone and then Maurizio Viroli, were convinced that Machiavelli is a secular prophet. No? He's a prophet without religion, let's say, outside of religion. So their idea is the fact that he's living in prophetic times, starting Machiavelli, but then we have other prophets who are, the prophet is whom? Is the person, think about Martin Luther, think about, you know, everyone is, at that time, they didn't have any internet system for going through Zoom with, I don't know how many people are connected, 100 people, or, you know, an unlimited number of people online streaming. At that time, you should be there, you know? So one of the reasons why Leo X is failing and is criticized by Luther in 1517, 18, 19, and 20 until 1533 is because he's selling indulgences. No? Because John Tetzler, one of the most important preachers of the time of Luther, was like organizing a series of preachers who were going square by square in Europe, collecting what money, selling salvation in exchange of money. So that's what the preacher was. That was the way we used to attend, see, absorb at that period of time. So the preacher, in other words, the prophet, you know, because he's usually predicting that he will go to hell or to paradise, is a typical ingredient of this society. Sometimes I've made zapping, you know, in the US, we have more than in Italy or in Europe, this kind of phenomenon of the, you know, of the preacher in television, no? So of this kind of a person who has how can I say, charismatic, no? Like feedback to someone else. No? I'm very fascinated by that, which is something which is not explainable, in other words. It's like believing in God or not. No, there is nothing in the middle. You need to be a believer or you are not. So prophecy is not exclusively something connected to religion, because as I've said before, the idea of sacred, the idea of sacrality goes also beyond any possible kind of religious barrier or religious border or limit. And of course, we have many prophets. You know, I'm thinking about Christ and Mohammed. I'm thinking about Isaiah. You know, think about the Bible. And then we have prophetic philosophers, Karl Marx, no? Karl Marx, or, you know, those Friedrich Nietzsche, or many others were trying to predicting or sharing or proposing the perfect and ideal society. So I don't know if it's a prophecy or it's a utopia, you know? But anyway, so something in the middle there. People who are imagining the future, not coming out from the religious perspective, because it is easier to understand and explain this through the religious creed path. No, it's more difficult to talk about this topic when you are talking about the secular life. Savonarola is, to Machiavelli, is of course one of the first preachers in front of himself, one of the prophets, because Savonarola is doing a very simple kind of exercise in 1494, trying to recreating the kingdom of God on earth, demonizing Lorenzo the Magnificent, telling everybody that he was a blasphemous person, that he was tolerating sodomy, homosexuality, allowing everyone to do whatever he would have or she would have loved to do in the city of Florence. In other words, leading the city into a progressive descent of sin. And of course, the prophecy of Savonarola, which was really impacting Machiavelli a lot, because as I've told you, Machiavelli was very young, 1469, 1494. No? So this is the moment in which he's listening to the preaching of Savonarola in the squares in San Marco and beyond. That this kind of corruption will lead Florence into a despotic regime, something negative for the community. Cyrus was one of the ways for defining Charles VIII, as I'm writing here in this slide. And of course, who is Cyrus? Is the person, this is the king who's leading out from Babylon, the idea of corruption, the idea of anarchy, the idea of something which is not connected to a right path. This is again Savonarola preaching in front of an audience. Of course, Savonarola is going too far. I've mentioned here Alexander VI, the Pope, who is like excommunicating himself, because one of the main topics which is underlined by Savonarola is the corruption of the clergy. Massimo Firpo wrote down the most important essays and papers on this topic. So the prophecy or the prophetic sermons of Savonarola warned the Florentines that they were going outside of the city of salvation, in other words. Vabbè, Frateschi and Arrabbiati, the city is divided in two, typical, Welsh Ghibellines, white, blacks, Albizzi, Medici. Florence is very used to this kind of subdivision, which was always concluding itself into a fake peace, with a lot of exiled people sent to exile into a progressive marginalization of the society. And of course, at the end of the life of Savonarola is conditioning a lot Machiavelli, because he says, okay, this prophet who is not armed, without arms, is failing. He cannot defend himself. So Machiavelli, one of the things which gave to him the aura of mythology was the fact that the politician needs to defend himself. So power needs to be defended. No? So the idea of the failure of a not armed, unarmed prophet is leading everyone to a progressive decline. Savonarola was simply sentenced to death with 2 other friars and burned at the stake in May 1498. These are the names of those who were not only connecting me to a single prophet, Savonarola, but we have Francesco da Montepulciano, we have Giovanni Di Carlo. So preachers, prophets, those who were going in front of an audience, telling them salvation can be reached this way. Don't act this way because you will go to hell. We're many, in every corner, let's say, in this period of time. And in the meantime, Machiavelli is Segretario di Stato. Machiavelli is handling his political primary responsibilities because his salary is paid by the Republic of Florence. He's an employee of the Republic of Florence. One of the first thing that is handling is the revolt of the city of Pisa. At that time, a city which was acquired, as I've told you before, at the beginning of the 1400s, then these situations were always, fragile in themselves. Revolts against the dominant city were always in front of any potential moment. And Machiavelli is writing down many speeches, many discourses, is sharing many thoughts about how to recontrol or going back to controlling the city of Pisa at the time. And one of the main things that he's saying is that we need to use the army. We need to use, strength. Without this, of course, mentioning the example of Savonarola, you cannot control a satellite city like Pisa is. And Filippo Casavecchia, who was born in 1472, very close to Machiavelli. Machiavelli had many friends, of course. Machiavelli was un ragazzaccio. Very friendly, let's say. Tells him, every day I discover in you a greater prophet than the Jews or any other people ever had. No? So this is something which is written by Filippo Casavecchia and defines Machiavelli a prophet. Because Machiavelli was previewing the fact that the city-state of Pisa could be controlled only if Florence would have used or would have menaced the satellite city with soldiers. You are a prophet, no? So this is in the streets of Florence. We have this kind of, that's the reason why I'm going into, titling this chapter prophecy, prophetic times. And then a few words about Leone X. Leone X is another very important ingredient in the life of Machiavelli, because Leone is Giovanni de' Medici, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, someone who was elected cardinal with the will of Lorenzo the Magnificent at the age of 13, when Lorenzo dies in 1492. And in 1513, Leo, meaning Giovanni de' Medici, is elected Pope. He died very young, 1521, but in this period of time, he was good enough on the way, or bad enough to bring to Rome the Medicean imprint into power, mostly financing a lot of works of arts, spending a lot of money, and being in the need of collecting and filling the empty chests of the Church of Rome at that time through itinerant preachers, which meant the critical imprinting of Luther against the papacy. So Leo is the reason why Luther is nailing the 95 Theses in Wittenberg, 1517. So chronology here, I think, serves a lot. But Leo is also, I don't want to say the prophet, but someone who perfectly knew that the reinforcement of power of a political as well as a spiritual position as that of the Pope could be reinforced with the idea of patronage. So, again, a prophet which was at the court of Lorenzo of Machiavelli. Machiavelli saw him as well as the others. And the influence of Leo X, or the story of the evolution of Leo, led Machiavelli to think and reflect about realpolitik and how your behavior is reflected into the political framework what you are living. And of course, I put some evidence on Martin Luther. In this case, painted in a portrait by Granach. Luther, I think, is a very important character for not only the Medici family, but also for the background of Machiavelli, because as an observer, he was seeing that not only the Republic of Florence was ready to be led in an uncertain territory, politically speaking, but also Christianity was at that time menaced by the idea of disgregation. And Luther, don't forget, that is a member of the church. Sometimes we think about Luther as someone, an outsider. He was an Augustinian monk. In other words, an internal element which is criticizing simply the corruption of the clergy. So prophecy, and going backwards to prophecy and prediction. The other element which is very important in the life of Machiavelli is the following Medici Pope, Giulio de' Medici, Clement VII. Clement is his nephew to Lorenzo the Magnificent, cousin to Giuliano de' Medici, Leo X. And another very important Pope who is like in front of probably the most important moment to the Church of Rome, because he is leading the Church of Rome in the moment in which Protestantism is floating into Europe. Okay, so the idea of Christianity is not anymore united. It's divided in two, Christian Catholicism and Christian Protestantism. The two creeds are only combined in few sacraments. Okay, but some sacraments are not anymore shared. So it means that the power of the Church of Rome, which was transformed through the years in what? The paying of the decima, of the 1/10 of the income of every state, was progressively reduced. So Clement was another prophet who tried to resolve the floating of something which would have dismantled the unity of the Church of Rome. Then I'm going towards the end of this second chapter, very fast, with mentioning what he wrote while he was forced into exile in Sant'Andrea in Percusione. I mentioned the prince in 1513. Then we have at the beginning of the writing of the discourses on the first decade of Titus Livy, started in 1513 as well. Then he stopped writing them. And according to Francesco Bausi and many other philologists and historians, he went back with writing and completing them from 1518 to 1519, more or less at the beginning of the 20s, he was done with the discourses. I've not mentioned if Machiavelli was a Republican defender or if he was a monarchical defender. Okay, well, let's wait for the third part of the chapter, the myth, no? Or the anti-myth. Then the Mandragola, which apparently is a very simple kind of comedy, is a theatrical representation, but in practice, he talks about honesty. Machiavelli talks about honesty. Messerniccia is a corrupted person who wants to have her wife getting pregnant, but is not able to do that. And then Callimaco, who with the inganno, has what he wants, not being in love with this woman. So in other words, so the goal is reached through, dribbling the idea of honesty again. And here Machiavelli says that when you have not honest kind of power, you are leading yourself into an uncharted territory. A metaphor again. Then L'Asino, then we have the letters, continuously writing letters. Machiavelli wrote down many letters. We have recently had the opportunity, thanks to a series of scholars, of having published all the letters written by Machiavelli and the correspondence of Machiavelli in 3 volumes published by Salerno Editore in Rome and edited by Francesco Bausi, which who I mentioned before. So we know everything now about the writing of Machiavelli. And then we have The Art of War. And to conclude, the Florentine Histories, which are probably one of the most important books that Machiavelli wrote. The Histories of Florence. Florentine Histories were commissioned by Clement VII, the Pope, because they grew up together, they knew each other. Machiavelli said towards the end of his life, Machiavelli is in his 50s, alone in the middle of nowhere, Sant'Andrea in Percussina. Now with my scooter, I can go there in 20 minutes, but for him, horseback would have meant more or less a day horseback to reach Florence. So no one would have done this ever. So you were marginalized staying there. So he felt himself with the background he had, with the patrimony he had, with the experience he had, with the anxiety he had, writing down the prints, writing down the discourses and all the writings he was making, was writing, that he would have deserved something more. Clement VII gave him the chance of writing probably the book of his life, the Florentine Histories. And of course, Machiavelli found himself in the middle of the pond, because a Medici Pope is commissioning me to write down the history of the city of Florence. And I was one of the main enemies of the Medici in the 1400s, not because I was against Lorenzo, but because I was against any possible kind of rise of any tyranny. And the Medici could have represented this. So we have a discussion of Machiavelli brainstorming about this and how to handle the different phases of the history of Florence, from the rise of the priors in the 1280s, from the plague of 1348, how the problem was resolved, the Ciompi uprising of 1378. How can I handle the fact that Salvestro de' Medici, guided the mob of the Popolani Minori between June and September 1378. So Machiavelli is finding himself in an uncharted territory with this, but he wrote down a majestic kind of book, which I've used a lot for my PhD dissertation, because his view is always interesting, always. Now, the myth. Machiavelli is a Republican thinker. Machiavelli is a defender of monarchy. I would say, to answer this question before the conclusion of this lecture, this is a wrong approach. Because Machiavelli was not a Guelph or a Ghibelline, or a white or a black, or a defender of the Albizzi or the Medici, or should you want to use soccer kind of metaphor, Fiorentina or Juventus, no? Or Manchester and Liverpool. I don't know in England how it works anyways. Machiavelli wrote down what he saw in front of himself, tried to give an answer to the peculiar situation in which he was in front of. The Prince is not, according to me, a book in which you have a writer who is defending the idea of monarchy. I'm deeply convinced that Machiavelli was mostly thinking about the way in which the Medici were leading Florence in the 1400s, not in the 1500s, because he knew perfectly history. And the crypto-signoria, so historians have defined the relationship between Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo from 1434 to 1492 in many ways. But surely an element is very clear to Machiavelli, the fact that Florence is a republic, and I've stressed this a lot at the beginning of this lecture. And he knew perfectly the mechanisms of this republican system. So Machiavelli is not interested in talking about the prince or whatever it is. Machiavelli is interested in the common good. Machiavelli is trying to have the perfect and ideal way for leading a government, period. And if a prince who is, then I have the comparison with Baldassare Castiglione, Book of the Courtier, in a few slides. if I remember correctly, is the perfect and ideal politician, is simply describing the perfect and ideal politician, how a politician should act, should handle his or her personal position. So, and here I go with the critical, approach to the way in which I approach to Machiavelli, the ideal society. So he's thinking deeply to answer the question, how should I give suggestions, share suggestions, if I would like to have for Florence an ideal society. We don't know if he saw this beautiful painting, which was done at the end of the 1400s, 1490s. We don't know who is the author, probably Fra Caravale, Raphael. There are many interpretations about that. Written here, attribution, the ideal city, which is in Baltimore now. But the ideal city is perfectly in front of us with the goal, that of inviting us to share the sense of the beauty for reaching the common good. The Colosseum, the Arch of Constantine, the first Roman emperor who is making entry with the Edict of Milan in 315, Christianity as a state religion, and then the baptistry of Florence are the three elements which are in front of us. We don't know if Machiavelli saw this picture, this painting, which is like this, not so big, but simply amazing, one of my main favorite paintings ever. But surely he was reflecting the way in which Castiglione was reflecting, the way in which Baldassar Castiglione was reflecting, thinking about the perfect courtier. A book divided in 4 chapters. The book of the courtier is divided in 4 chapters. One is devoted to women, actually. And what do we have in the book of the courtier and in the prince? And in the ideal city by Fra Caravale or whomever he is. The anxiety of a society which is trying to answering only one question: how can we create peace? How can we create the society in which we can have shared values and leading the good governmental life, let's say. So I'm mentioning these 3 examples, but you can find also others in the same period of time, in which, from different perspectives, you reach the same goal. So it's totally wrong to consider The Prince as a book which is tailored to defend monarchies, tailored to defend vertical powers. The Prince is a citizen who is member of a community, and probably is referring to the Doge of Venice, a republican system as well, or to the model of the constitutional democracy, constitutional monarchy, which is typical of England nowadays and many other countries in the world, but not a despotic ruler. The myth, the anti-myth, the Christ and the Antichrist, Machiavelli brought here and there. So Machiavelli has been interpreted, in a variety of ways. The difference between Christian Catholics, the difference between Christian Protestants. For Protestants, an atheist, someone without God. For Innocent Gentilier, who didn't have any idea who Machiavelli was. Eminent scholars like Riccardo Bruscagli and many others, had not myself, had revealed with their writings that Gentilier didn't have any idea who Machiavelli was. He was simply an excuse for writing about what he would have loved to write. So that's the moment in which we have, at the beginning of the 1600s, end of the 1500s, a few decades after Machiavelli dies, the use of Machiavelli into, let's say, a popular way, of interpreting Machiavelli. Think about Shakespeare, and Henry VI, and the approach that he had with Marlowe as well on considering Machiavelli. So Machiavelli was used also in more recent times, let's say during the 1700s, and we'll see in the 1800s as well, in the Encyclopedia by Diderot, Fichte, Hegel, many are those who have used the writings of Machiavelli in a way or in another. And all of them were always counterbalancing Machiavelli in two, let's say, philosophical approaches. One, was he a good Christian? Was he the Antichrist? Was he a defender of monarchies? Was he a defender of republicanisms? Machiavelli knew perfectly his past. Machiavelli knew perfectly the evolution of the history of Rome. And the discourses, which I've not touched so much in this lecture, but which are probably the most important writing that Machiavelli made while he was in exile at Sant'Andrea in Pecusina, are evidently the writing through which we can use the comparison between the evolution of the Roman history into the Renaissance. Rome had the evolution from being a monarchy, passing into a republican system, and then entering to with Augustus, with the imprinting of an empire. And then, of course, at the end, 476, 5th century after Christ, boom, the collapse, the end. So we have more or less the circularity of history, so which goes from nothing into the evolution of a more or less oligarchical system. So this makes me think, also to the society in which we are living. So Machiavelli is also someone through which we can discuss about what we're living. So the status of our democracies, the status of the relationship between ourselves and the idea of the state, the common good, the thing to be shared among the many. Sometimes we have also historians or political scientists, McCormick, for instance. I remember the university in which he was teaching in the US, but who considers Machiavelli a populist. So the interpretations are many. But surely I think that one of the most interesting interpretations was that of the Federalists, the founders of the American Constitution. In a few months, we have the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Dichiarazione di Indipendenza, Declaration of Independence, not the writing of the Constitution, but the Dichiarazione di Indipendenza from the 14 colonies in 1776. And going beyond any possible kind of historical data, but surely Franklin, surely Madison, and many others used Machiavelli, I think, in a proper way. So Machiavelli as a human being, Machiavelli as the man, Machiavelli as the observer, Machiavelli as someone who took care about what he was touching, what he was living in. I think that the American Constitution is one of the most, and I hope that no one will touch it, democratic constitutions in the world. because probably it was massively inspired by what I was mentioning before, Diderot and the French Revolution. So there is a virtual bridge between what was shared in the experience of the French Revolution into the writing of the American Constitution, which is the beginning, I think, of the real beginning of the of course, the Magna Carta Libertatum and so on, but of contemporary democracies, the writing of contemporary constitutions. And these people had, Franklin was one of, with Jefferson, one of the main presidents to have the, all the books written by Machiavelli in front of himself every day. And Adams as well. Theory, a theoretical approach, we don't know. And we don't know if probably they observed properly the writing of Machiavelli. But surely their approach inspired one of the most interesting examples of contemporary modern constitutions. As well, Italy had Machiavelli was discussed as well in the 1800s. I've mentioned Mazzini, Gioberti, but also Manzoni, in a critical moment for this country, in which we had the problem of the unification of a country which had lived for centuries into a territorial difference, so between regions, the Duchy of Tuscany, the Republic of Venice. I've mentioned before the main powers inside of the peninsula. One of the problems in the 1800s was Machiavelli a good Christian or was he not? So the problem of trying to interpret Machiavelli in a, I don't want to say a religious way, but absorbing from the writings of Machiavelli only the critical aspects that he was sharing in his writings about the corruption of the clergy, which was not announced by Machiavelli, as I showed in this lecture, but mostly by prophets, like Savonarola first and Luther later. And the influence of Machiavelli, I think, is simply enormous. So I think that a conclusion to a lecture like this is not so easy. And I would like to leave it open to any possible counter interpretation. But surely, Western intellectuals were massively influenced by Machiavelli. I would like to point out that his experience is mostly based on practice. Machiavelli was mostly answering to the condition in which he was living after having observed through his experience what he was doing serving the Republic of Florence. According to him, one of the most developed, interesting examples of political systems which were existing in the moment in which he was living. So, political realism, Machiavelli as a defender of monarchies, Machiavelli as a defender of republican systems. This is not, I think, the right way to approach to Machiavelli. Probably the right way to approach to Machiavelli is to go back to the sources and trying to reread what he wrote without trying to give any possible personal interpretation to the period of time in which he was living. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Fabrizio, for a very fascinating tour de force about the man and the myth. Yeah, Gio. So, as is our custom, we'll now have the moment for questions and answers and brief comments. Rules are the same as always. If you're in the room and want to speak, please put your hand up so I can bring you the microphone, because then the Zoomers can hear what you're saying. On the Zoom, if you want to join in, the best way is probably to put something in the chat and we'll read it out for you. But if you particularly want to talk to us, unmute it, we'll hear you in the room. So who would like to go first with a thought or question? Oh, whatever.
It'd be scary.
It's been a very comprehensive talk, so maybe you've just got lots to think about.
Yeah.
Let's see if there's what's going on the chat. No, they've all gone to sleep on the chat. Oh.
Yes.
We got someone here. Okay.
How would you compare? Is this on?
Mm-hmm.
How would you compare the? I want to. It's a loaded word. The amorality, if you will, of Machiavelli, the sort of distant observational accoutrements of how power is acquired, with the current political situation in America and Donald Trump in particular, in terms of someone who is attempting to leverage the mechanisms of power across the board in a cultural society, and is viewed, I guess, in a lot of ways as a very amoral, possibly immoral individual. What would you? Does that make sense?
Okay, so let's put it this way. Every politician should read Machiavelli first. So I think that, more than others, he wrote down textbooks for politicians. No matter if you're talking about Trump or Meloni or Blair or Thatcher or Veltroni or many others, so no matter if they are from the left or from the right or or now or yesterday. I think that Machiavelli is, one of the other critical approaches to Machiavelli is to consider Machiavelli as the first thinker who separates ethics from, religion, morality from religion. But I think that Machiavelli is not interested in separating them this way. I think that he's interested in trying to give an answer. An answer coming out from the experience he had. So he's a problem solver more than everything. He's someone who is trying to resolve situation. So I don't know if he is the first thinker who separates, ethics from politics and so on. I know by reading what he wrote that he is mostly interested on the common good. I don't know if nowadays we have politicians interested on pursuing the common good everywhere, especially in the West, which is something to which Machiavelli is mostly referring. And that's the reason why the first part of my answer was simply connected to the reading of Machiavelli. So, because Machiavelli is interested in trying to pursue the common good, il bene comune.
Okay, we have some questions and comments on the chat, so I'll get into those. Alice Yanovska says, "Thank you for an excellent lecture. In your personal opinion, if Savonarola didn't suffer from mental illness, would he have been able to do what Martin Luther did later? It seems like he had many similar ideas and had the drive as well."
I don't know if Savonarola was crazy or not. The only thing I know is that if you read the Prediche sopra Geo, or because these preachers were like a professor in class, now students are getting notes from what you're writing, what you're sharing, what you're lecturing. Savonarola was simply saying the same thing that would have been said a few decades later by Luther. So Savonarola is criticizing the corruption of the church, and the approach and the evidence of that he was right on this. I don't want to say that, so I'm not a defender of Savonarola, but I'm simply saying that in that period of time, the church was mostly a political, so having a role in the church was a political, what the church offered were mostly political offices. And Giovanni de' Medici is the evidence of that. God gave us this opportunity. Let's enjoy it. Let's get it. The Medicean perspective to spirituality. So surely there was something to be corrected from Francis, who dies in 1226, to Leo X. There is an ocean of difference in the approach to spirituality. So this is without any doubt this way. because it was mostly connected to the idea of practicing patronage, reinforcing political power, more than guiding the flock, sharing the spiritual approach to the creed. So, in other words, Savonarola and Luther are more or less telling the same things. And probably Savonarola, according to Machiavelli, was disarmed, unarmed, and could not defend himself so much. Luther has an army of followers. Luther has an army of students who are writing and publishing what he wrote, what he said. And in fact, he didn't nail the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses were, transcribed by his students. And the strength of Luther is determined by the fact that he had a flock following him.
Interesting. Okay, so greetings to you from Peru, from your friend Francis Luis Figueroa Lozano. Yeah, who said you enjoyed it very much. Lots of fan mail. Valerie Shria Martin, Chiara Ferguson are both saying thank you for refreshing, particularly pertinent to contemporary politics. Point here. So thank you very much for that. Any more in the room? We got one here.
Thank you also for the talk. Enjoy it very much. The discussion about Savonarola was something I was going to ask about. In the end, perhaps the ideas triumph via Luther. Maybe there's a question of Savonarola being too early. But I would have thought, you mentioned that Machiavelli's criticism was that he didn't arm him. He wasn't armed essentially to defend his position. I would have thought, it's been a long time since I read The Prince, that the comment would have been that he was too absolutist, that is not realpolitik, and that the triumph of the Medici before Savonarola were that they weren't absolutists. They played whatever was going on at the time. Did Machiavelli comment about that at all, or is it hard to say?
Machiavelli is referring to an unarmed prophet. But this doesn't mean that the prophet should have been, fighting with swords and so on and so forth. We were mentioning before that Luther is not followed by an army. Luther is followed by a crowd of people. So the flock is following him. That is the strength of a politician, of a preacher, of someone who is leading a lecture, who is listened from the others. So I think that Savonarola was probably going to the extremes because he was really, really judging badly Caesar IV. Then, of course, there is an internal not debate, but conflict within Florence in the, let's say, last 20 years of the 1400s. The Pazzi conspiracy is an evidence of that. Florence, the fact that the Medici were going too far, were going too close to the papacy, became the papal bankers. There is a juncture within which many were those who wanted to have them going down. And Savonarola was not able to create a unity within the city. He's dividing the city in two. And when you have a division, you won't find any unity. And that's the reason why he failed. Because he was not able to create, unity between the Arrabbiati and the Frateschi. So, and this is typical from Florence. Florence is a city which, always argues with itself. The nature of Florentine people is really connected to that. I'm thinking about its history, the Welsh and the Ghibellines. I was mentioning this before. Then the Welsh won on the Ghibellines, and then the Welsh divided in the black Welsh and white Welsh. And then the black Welsh won on the white Welsh. That's what happened. And then we have the Parte Guelfa fighting against, the Popolani Minori. And then the Ciompi uprising, the Popolo Grasso is the first moment of the Ciompi uprising in 1378 is against the Parte Guelfa, against the Welsh party, the black Welfs. So once it's used to this bipolarism, I don't know how to define it. I wrote down a book on this. My PhD dissertation is on this. With the love to this city, but the fact that this city never found, a solution of unity, and which was probably its strength.
I was Machiavelli supporting the saying, if you can't keep it together, you can't keep out.
Absolutely. Machiavelli was absolutely convinced that the only solution would have been to create unity within the city, trying to together going towards the common good in a way or in another.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the time when we need to wrap this up and get some wine from our friends in Bicchio Maggio. If you want to go on the tour, don't forget to buy a ticket, so I'll sell you one right now. Thanks to everybody here and on the Zoom for your participation. Big thanks to Alice Vogler for the sponsorship, and thanks particularly to Fabrizio for a great lecture. Thank you.